Recently, Donald Trump has announced sweeping new tariffs against basically every country in the world. These new tariffs come on top of months of speculation and threats to impose tariffs on countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. In response, many other countries, such as Canada and Europe, have promised to retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on the United States. But what are tariffs? How do they work? Why might a country want to impose tariffs? And most importantly, what is the impact of tariffs on individuals and businesses? Welcome to Global Issues 101. I'm Dr. Stephen Beard, a scholar of political science and international relations. In this episode, we will cover the basics of tariffs. We will first discuss what tariffs are and how do they work. We will then go over briefly why a country might want to impose tariffs. And then we will talk about what is the impact of tariffs on people and businesses. Fundamentally, tariffs are a tax on imports. That is, they are a tax on goods coming into a country. This tax is imposed at the border as the goods cross the border and are paid by the importer. So whoever is actually bringing the goods across the border into the country. In the United States, this is the importer of record. As an example, let's imagine that the United States has tariffs on Japanese automobiles. As these automobiles enter the United States, they would be charged a tariff. And whoever is picking up the car from the port, the distributor that is picking up the car, would have to pay the tariff as they pick up the car. Typically, the cost of tariffs is then passed on to whoever they sell the car to. So the distributor would pass on the tariffs to the car dealerships, who would ultimately pass on the costs of tariffs to the consumers buying the cars. While most tariffs are paid by corporations and businesses, it is conceivable that individuals will have to pay tariffs themselves. So, as an example, imagine that you go on a vacation to France, and while in France, you buy several expensive bottles of French wine to bring back to the United States and enjoy after your vacation is over. As you re enter the United States, when you go through customs, get your passport checked to re enter the United States, you would also have to pay the appropriate tariff on those bottles of wine that you are bringing back across the border. Tariffs can have a couple variations. So it is possible to have different tariffs on different products. So it might be conceivable to have one tariff on Japanese automobiles and a different tariff on Japanese TVs. It is also conceivable to have different tariffs on different countries. So the United States might charge one tariff on Japanese automobiles and a different tariff on Korean automobiles and a different tariff on German automobiles. In general, tariffs are going to be charged as a percent of the value. So if there's a 10% tariff on a $10,000 car, the tariff would be $1,000. However, it is also possible that you could charge a flat rate per item. So perhaps you could have a tariff of $500 on every car, regardless of if it's a $5,000 car or a $50,000 car. So, why might a country want to impose tariffs or these taxes on goods coming into their country? Fundamentally, there are two main reasons. First, tariffs are a tax like any other tax, and so they are a way for the central government to gain revenue. In past centuries, tariffs might in fact make up the majority of the government's revenue. So, for instance, the main way that the federal government in the United States funded itself in the 1800s was through tariffs. However, in the present day, most developed countries will find it difficult to gain a substantial portion of their government budget through tariffs. So, the second and now more prevalent reason is to bolster domestic industries. As I will talk about next, tariffs tend to make domestic industries more competitive relative to foreign industries. So they can be a way to protect those domestic industries from foreign competition. However, because tariffs harm those foreign industries, other countries may want to retaliate to protect their own domestic industries and may even use tariffs as part of a negotiating strategy to try and reduce tariffs overall. So, negotiating to reduce tariffs by both countries. So, finally, what is the impact of tariffs on people and businesses? The impact of tariffs can be fairly complex, but in general, tariffs will have the following impacts. First, tariffs will help domestic producers that compete with the imports on which the tariffs are imposed. On the other side, tariffs will harm the foreign producers of those imports. Tariffs will harm consumers, and tariffs will harm domestic producers that use the imports as an input into their own production. Tariffs may also harm domestic producers that export to other countries if those other countries retaliate by imposing their own tariffs. The first main impact of tariffs is to harm foreign producers on which the tariffs are imposed. The tariffs raise the price of the goods that these foreign producers are making. So that is going to make those imported goods less competitive. So, in our previous example, if the United States imposes tariffs on Japanese automobiles, the price of Toyotas will increase, and so Toyotas will be less competitive against Ford or Chevy cars. In response, the foreign producer has to either reduce sales, they can't sell in as much because their goods are now more expensive, and so this will reduce sales and harm the foreign producer. Alternatively, a foreign producer might lower their price to try and maintain their competitiveness. By lowering their price, they are also making less money. So, either way, the foreign producers are going to be harmed by tariffs. On the flip side, tariffs can help domestic producers that compete with the imports on which the tariff is imposed. The price of these imports will be increased by the tax that is imposed as they cross the border. So this will make domestic products of the same type more competitive. This means that the domestic producer will either be able to sell more because their product is more competitive, and they may also be able to increase their price because the products that they are competing against are also more expensive due to the tariff. So, in our example, when the United States imposes tariffs on Japanese automobiles, this raises the cost of the Japanese automobiles, which would make a Ford car more competitive. Ford will either be able to sell more cars because people will buy the Ford that is now not as expensive relative to the Japanese car, or Ford can increase their price to match the price increase of the tariff, or some mixture of both. Because tariffs lead to increased prices, they will harm consumers basically across the board. So tariffs will increase prices on the good that the tariff is imposed on. Directly, tariffs will increase the cost of the imports. So, in our example of US tariffs on Japanese automobiles, the price of a Toyota to a consumer will include at least some of the price of the tariff because the tariff cost is passed down to the car dealership and ultimately the consumer. Competing domestic producers will also likely raise their prices because Ford is now has less competition from Toyota, they can raise their prices. So, regardless of whether a consumer is wanting to buy a Toyota or a Ford car, if we impose tariffs on cars, cars will become more expensive. This means because tariffs increase prices, tariffs will almost necessarily increase inflation at least somewhat. Tariffs will likely also harm producers using imported inputs. Production is increasingly transnational. It is increasingly rare that all of a product is made within one country. So producers are also importers of various import inputs into their production. If we impose a tariff on these inputs, that will harm the producer because the producer now has to pay more for their inputs. So they either have to raise their prices or accept lower profits. So, as an example, if we also put a tariff on steel, this Ford uses steel. The tariff will increase the price of steel on Ford. And then Ford either has to raise their price to include the increased price of steel, or they simply have to accept lower profits. So, tariffs on inputs into production will also harm some producers. Finally, tariffs may harm domestic exporters. Other countries are likely to raise tariffs in response, which would make exports, us selling goods to a different country, more expensive. This would then, in turn, harm exporters. The effect on individuals becomes somewhat more complex because most individuals are both consumers and producers. We buy products and are a consumer that way, but we also work in jobs and so are part of the production process, and we get wages as producers. All individuals will have higher prices, and so they will be harmed as consumers. However, the effect on the individual as a producer will depend on what industry they are in. So, as a worker, if an individual is working in a business that competes with imports, they would be helped. If they are working for a business that uses imports or possibly one that exports to other countries, they would be harmed. The overall effect on the individual will depend on this combination. So, an individual that is working in an industry that competes with imports will pay higher prices, but might get higher wages as well. And it's unclear what would predominate. So, if we impose tariffs on Japanese automobiles, an auto worker would pay higher prices on automobiles and any other goods that tariffs are imposed on, but would also um, make more money, likely, because they're in an industry that is being helped by the tariffs. Now, if on the other hand, if you're in an industry that is just using imports or an industry that is exports, you're going to be harmed. You may lose your job because the industry becomes less competitive or your wages may go down. And so you are doubly harmed both as a consumer and a producer. So the actual effect depends on certainly the higher prices, but also the extent to which you are working in an industry that is going to be helped by tariffs or harmed by tariffs, or perhaps neither. So, in review and conclusion, tariffs are taxes on imports. They are taxes on goods brought into the country imposed at the time that those goods are brought into the country. Tariffs might be imposed to raise revenue. In the present day, are more oftenly imposed to protect some domestic producers, although they may harm other domestic producers. Overall, tariffs will help domestic producers that compete with the imports on which the tariff is imposed. Conversely, they will harm the foreign producers that make the imports. They will harm consumers by increasing prices, and they will also harm some domestic producers that use the imports. So, if you're using imports as an input in your production, that increases the price of production. It is also possible that tariffs will harm domestic producers that export to other country because other countries may impose their own tariffs in response to the tariffs. So that is all I have for today on tariffs. Thank you, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next episode.